I'm Lauren Mitchell, 21 years old, and the memory of that Christmas dinner still feels like it lives inside my bones. My father smiled across the table, his voice steady, as he asked if I liked the new house. The words were so simple, but they hit the room like an earthquake. My fork slipped from my hand, cousins stopped mid-bite, and even the glow of the candles seemed to flicker. Everyone turned toward me, waiting for my response, while my stepmother's glass trembled just enough to give her away. I didn't know what house he was talking about, but I could feel that the answer was about to change everything. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to discover the truth in the most unexpected moment. I grew up in a world that looked ordinary from the outside, but it was full of shadows after my mother passed away when I was just 5. My father, David, was a civil engineer who poured himself into projects that kept him overseas for months at a time. For a while, I stayed with relatives until he remarried, and that's when Brenda stepped in with her son, Tyler. Neighbors admired her for keeping the household polished and perfect, but behind closed doors, I was treated more like an inconvenience than a daughter. Brenda set the rules, and Tyler was her shining example of everything right, while I learned how to fade into the background. The difference between us was always clear. Tyler had the newest gadgets, celebrated milestones, and the kind of praise that fills a home with noise. My own victories were brushed aside with polite smiles or casual remarks about hobbies and impractical dreams. Even when I tried to share something that mattered to me, like a painting or an acceptance letter from an art program, it was redirected into silence. Over time, I convinced myself that needing less was safer than asking for anything. My father never raised his voice or denied me outright, but his distance left wide gaps where Brenda's decisions took root. By the time I reached college, I had accepted my place at the edges of their family portrait. I worked part-time, took classes close to home, and lived as though space was on loan. Tyler's achievements were front and center, while my life unfolded quietly, with no one really paying attention. I told myself it didn't matter, that strength came from standing alone. But the truth is, I was waiting for some proof that I hadn't been forgotten completely. That night at the dinner table, when my father asked me about a house I had never seen, I realized something had been kept from me, something meant to change the way I lived. And as the silence grew heavier, I could feel the pieces shifting. Part of me wanted to let the moment pass, but another part knew the answer was already buried in the walls around us. What my father thought I had been given was the very thing that had been taken away. I was not always the quiet figure in the corner of the room. There was a time when laughter filled my days, when my mother's voice tucked me into bed with stories of stars and faraway places. Her name was Emily, and for the first 5 years of my life, she was the center of my world. Then, without warning, she was gone. A blood clot after a routine surgery took her life, and the warm foundation of my childhood collapsed in a single day. My father was left standing in that emptiness, and although he never said it outright, he carried his grief in silence. David Mitchell was a man who had already spent much of his time in the field, building roads and bridges across states. But after her death, he buried himself even deeper in work. At first, I stayed with my Aunt Carol, then with my grandmother, moving from one spare bedroom to another as my father flew from site to site. By the time I was 9, he had remarried, and the house I returned to did not feel like the one I remembered. Brenda arrived with her polished smile and a son who seemed to shine in every direction. Tyler was only a year older than me, but he carried himself with a confidence I could never match. He was tall, handsome, and quickly earned a reputation as the golden boy of the neighborhood. Teachers loved him, neighbors praised him, and Brenda stood close behind, presenting their family like something out of a picture frame. To everyone outside, she was the devoted mother and supportive wife who kept the household steady while my father was overseas. Inside, her affection for me was thin and fleeting, as though I were something she had to make room for, rather than someone she wanted to know. The imbalance showed up in the little things first. Tyler was given the larger bedroom, the new phone, and lessons for anything he wanted to try. I was given hand-me-down sweaters and quiet reminders that I should be grateful. Brenda spoke kindly when others were watching, but when it was just us, her tone shifted into clipped instructions and subtle exclusions. By the time my father returned for his short visits, everything was staged to look perfect. There were photos of Tyler winning awards, Tyler decorating the Christmas tree, Tyler fixing something around the house. If I appeared at all, I was blurry in the background as though I had wandered into the frame by mistake. It did not take long for me to understand my place. There were family dinners I was not invited to, and birthdays that passed with nothing more than a cupcake left on the counter. When Tyler graduated high school, Brenda hosted a party that resembled a wedding, complete with a catered dinner and a rented tent in the yard. When I was accepted into an art program at the community college, Brenda said it was a nice hobby to keep me occupied. My father congratulated me over a weak video call from a hotel room halfway across the world, his words kind but distracted. I began to believe that if I wanted to survive, I had to take up as little space as possible. That was how I learned to disappear politely. I kept my head down, folded, laundry-cleaned dishes, and slipped out of the way whenever Tyler's friends filled the living room. The house carried Brenda's taste in every detail, from the curtains to the furniture to the pictures on the wall. I asked once if I could hang a watercolor painting I had worked on for weeks, a rainy street corner, soft and muted, the kind of image that held more of me than I could put into words. She smiled without warmth and told me it would be better in my room. I never asked again. Tyler was not cruel. He did not need to be. His silence spoke louder than any insult. He grew up under the steady glow of his mother's praise, while I adjusted to being unseen. He walked across stages to applause, and I clapped from the audience unnoticed. He never had to ask for more, because the system was already tilted in his favor. It was not jealousy that kept me awake at night, but the quiet certainty that no matter how much I tried, I would never matter in the same way. Even when I began to think about what came after high school, the answer was given before I had the chance to form it myself. I wanted to apply to an art program in Chicago, a place that felt like the start of something new. Brenda shut the idea down with a single sentence about money being reserved for Tyler's tuition. Art, she told me, was a luxury, not a career. Stability mattered more than dreams, and stability meant staying close, going to community college, and finding a job that would not take me too far away. I folded the brochure in half and placed it at the bottom of a drawer. From then on, my life narrowed. I balanced part-time hours at a framing shop with classes at the local college. I drew in the evenings when no one was watching, and saved what little I could, though I knew it would never stretch far. Tyler's achievements continued to fill the house while I lived like a guest who never fully unpacked. My father came and went, offering brief bursts of affection before vanishing into another assignment. He believed Brenda's emails that everything was fine, never seeing the way she had erased me from the center of his home. I told myself I could endure it, that maybe some people were simply meant to stay quiet. But beneath that stillness, there was always a thin crack waiting to split. I just did not know yet what would force it open. I learned how to keep quiet in ways most people never notice. When Brenda organized her carefully planned dinners, I stayed in my room and waited until the plates were cleared. If relatives came over, Tyler was introduced proudly while I was asked to carry dishes or fetch drinks. Even at school, I could feel the difference. Tyler's football games brought the family out in full force, but the year I played in the orchestra for the winter concert, no one sat in the audience for me. It wasn't always loud neglect. Most of the time, it was silence. Birthdays came and went with little recognition. Some years there was a cake, but no singing, no gathering, no photographs to look back on later. I began to tell myself that I didn't need attention, that it was easier to expect nothing than to risk being disappointed. Over time, that kind of thinking became second nature. When I brought home good grades, Brenda would glance at my report card and offer a polite smile before folding laundry. If Tyler earned the same marks, the news was announced at dinner, and my father would beam through a video call, his voice brimming with pride. My own achievements passed like shadows, noticed for a second, and then forgotten. I started keeping sketchbooks under my bed, filling the pages with drawings I never showed anyone. Art became the only space where I didn't feel like an intruder. Even simple requests seemed too much. I asked once if I could join a summer art program in town, and Brenda told me we didn't have the resources. She reminded me that my father's money was already set aside for Tyler's future, and that stability mattered more than chasing hobbies. Her words left no room for argument. I folded the brochure and threw it away before my father returned from his trip. There were times when I wondered whether my father truly understood what was happening inside his own house. He asked me about school during his brief calls and kissed my forehead when he was home, but his attention always slipped back to the projects that pulled him across the world. He seemed to believe Brenda's version of events, the one she carefully constructed with emails and photographs that kept me at the edges of the story. She sent him pictures of Tyler winning awards or decorating the Christmas tree, and if I appeared at all, it was only by accident. I began to disappear in my own mind as well. I stopped offering ideas at dinner, stopped asking for help, and convinced myself that invisibility was the best way to keep peace. Even when I succeeded at something that mattered to me, I told myself not to expect recognition. It became a kind of armor keeping disappointment from cutting too deep, but also keeping me from believing I deserved more. The contrast grew sharper as we got older. When Tyler announced his acceptance to college, Brenda planned a celebration that filled the yard with lights, music, and laughter. Family and neighbors gathered to congratulate him, and my father sent money for the event, even though he couldn't be there. A few months later, I was accepted into the community college art program, and Brenda brushed it off as a pastime. She told me it was good to have something to keep me busy until I found something practical. My father congratulated me from a hotel room in another country, his image flickering on the screen before the call dropped. By then I had stopped hoping for fairness. I worked part-time at a small framing shop, stacked my pay in a jar, hidden in my closet, and tried not to think about what might have been possible with more support. Brenda managed the house as if it belonged entirely to her and Tyler, and I was the visitor who stayed too long. The walls carried their photographs, their memories, their story. Mine were tucked away in a drawer where no one could see them. It was not cruelty that shaped me, but the steady weight of being erased. The family looked complete without me, and I started to believe that was the way it was supposed to be. Yet somewhere inside I knew it wasn't right. I could feel the edges of a truth I hadn't named yet, one that whispered that being invisible wasn't the same as not existing. I just didn't know when or how that truth would finally force its way into the open. 3 months before Christmas, I was scrolling through my phone when a photograph stopped me cold. Brenda stood smiling beside Tyler in front of a 2-story colonial with pale shutters and a red front door. They were both holding a set of keys, and the caption beneath it read, "So proud of my boy, new beginnings." I stared at the screen longer than I should have a hollow ache forming in my chest. I didn't ask questions, not then. I told myself there would be no real answer anyway. When Christmas came, that photo returned to me in an unexpected way. My father sat at the head of the table carving turkey, and with a wide smile, he asked me if I liked the new house. The room went still. Brenda's hand froze around her glass, her expression paling under the soft glow of the candles. Tyler lowered his eyes to his plate. I forced myself to ask which house he meant, though. Deep down, I already knew. Later that night, long after the dishes were cleared and the laughter had faded into silence, I lay awake unable to stop replaying his words. He had spoken with such certainty, as if I had already been there, already walked across those hardwood floors. I realized then that he believed the house had been mine all along. The truth sat heavy in my chest. Something had been kept from me, not lost by mistake, but hidden deliberately. The next morning, before anyone stirred, I crept into my father's study. The room smelled faintly of old paper and wood polish, a space Brenda rarely bothered with. My hands shook as I opened the file cabinet, searching for proof that I hadn't imagined everything. At first, I found nothing but bills and routine records, until my eyes caught a folder labeled Hollow Pine. I pulled it out and spread the papers across the desk. The documents were clear. Printed emails between my father and Brenda confirmed the purchase. The deed had been transferred to my name, scheduled to be given to me on my 20th birthday. I read line after line, my breath catching, as I saw my name written in black ink where it mattered most. My father had thought of me, planned something permanent for me, and it had been intercepted. Brenda had written back to him with a simple acknowledgement, all received. I'll make sure she gets it on her birthday. But that birthday had passed without a word, replaced instead by a photograph of Tyler smiling in front of that very house. My stomach twisted as I stacked the papers back together. It wasn't an oversight. It wasn't confusion. Brenda had taken something meant for me and quietly handed it to her son. My father, thousands of miles away, had no reason to doubt her. I pressed my palms against the desk and tried to steady myself, but the truth was too sharp to ignore. I had not just been forgotten, I had been erased deliberately. That afternoon, I drove to Hollow Pine. The neighborhood was quiet, lined with young trees and neatly trimmed lawns. As I turned the corner and saw the house in person, a strange mix of anger and longing rose inside me. It was beautiful in a modest way, with pale blue shutters and that red door from the photo. My name should have been on the mailbox, but instead it read, Tyler Mitchell. I parked across the street and watched. Minutes later, the front door opened, and Tyler stepped out wearing a sweatshirt and holding a bag of trash. He walked casually to the bin, tossed it in, and disappeared back inside, as if the house had always been his. My hands tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. He hadn't stolen it with malice, but he had accepted it without hesitation, knowing full well it wasn't his to take. I stayed parked there for nearly half an hour, unable to move. I thought about walking up to the door and ringing the bell, forcing a conversation neither of us wanted to have. But I already knew what he would say, or worse, what he wouldn't. Tyler had grown up expecting everything to tilt in his direction. He never questioned why. He never had to. As the sun dipped lower, I finally drove away. That night back in the house I had never truly belonged to, I kept silent. Brenda laughed at something on the television, a glass of wine balanced in her hand, completely at ease. She believed the matter was settled. Her son had the house, and I was still under her roof, living quietly, too accustomed to fading into the background. She didn't realize yet that the truth was already in motion. I sat awake until morning, the folder of documents spread across my bed. Each page confirmed what had been stolen and what was rightfully mine. I traced my name on the deed with the tip of my finger, steadying myself against the storm that was coming. I was finished being erased, and though Brenda didn't know it yet, the story she had written was about to be rewritten. The night after I found the deed, I could hardly close my eyes. I lay awake with the papers spread across my bed, every line of black ink reminding me that what should have been mine had been given away. The more I read, the more my resolve grew. I had spent years keeping quiet, years teaching myself to expect nothing, but this was different. This was proof, something I could hold in my hands, and it carried my name. The next morning, I drove to Hollow Pine again. The neighborhood looked calm, the kind of place where children rode bikes in the cul-de-sac and neighbors waved from their porches. Yet to me, the house across the street stood like a stolen promise. I parked in the same spot as before and watched Tyler step out to grab the morning paper. He bent down, stretching in the cool air, then went back inside without a second glance. For him, it was ordinary. For me, it was unbearable. I thought about walking up to the door, about forcing a confrontation right there on the porch. But the truth was, Tyler was not the one who had sealed those envelopes or replied to those emails. He had grown up expecting Brenda to clear his path, and she always had. If I was going to take back what belonged to me, it would not be in secret, and it would not be with Tyler alone. It had to be where all of us sat together, where lies could no longer hide behind silence. That night, I prepared myself. I slid the manila folder into my bag, making sure the documents were stacked neatly inside. I went over the conversation in my head, the questions I would ask, the answers I knew Brenda could not give without unraveling herself. It wasn't anger that steadied me, but clarity. I had been erased quietly for years, and if I stayed quiet now, it would never stop. Christmas dinner arrived with all the polish Brenda loved to show off. The dining room glowed with candles and crystal holders, silverware lined up perfectly beside folded napkins shaped like stars. She had spent the entire day preparing her movements, calm and precise, as if presentation alone could control the story. My father sat at the head of the table, freshly shaved, his eyes brighter than they had been in months. He had come home only a week earlier, his return as brief as always, and he seemed eager for a holiday that felt whole. Tyler sat to his right, Brenda to his left, and I was placed across from them, surrounded by cousins and uncles who still called me sweetheart without knowing me at all. The food was passed, conversation rose and fell, and then the moment came. My father looked at me with a proud smile and asked if I liked the house. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Forks paused, glasses trembled, and the room shifted into a silence so deep I could hear my own breath. I looked at him, then at Brenda, then at Tyler. "What house?" I asked, my voice steady. He chuckled softly, confused. "The one on Hollow Pine. Didn't Brenda show it to you on your birthday?" Brenda's hand froze around her glass. The smile she tried to hold wavered. Tyler kept his eyes fixed on the plate in front of him. My chest tightened, but I kept my tone calm. "No," I said. "I didn't get anything on my birthday. Not a key, not a letter, not a house." My father blinked, turning slowly toward Brenda. "Is that true?" he asked. She let out a laugh, thin and forced. "Lauren, don't be dramatic. That house wasn't right for you. It's too far from school, and you're already settled here." It made sense for Tyler. "You gave it to him." I said my words, cutting through her excuse. "You told Dad you'd give it to me. I read the emails. I saw the deed. My name was on it. You took it and handed it to your son." The air seemed to drain from the room. Relatives shifted uncomfortably. A wine glass clinked too hard against a plate, and the silence deepened. My father's face went pale as he turned fully toward Brenda. "Brenda," he said, his voice low but sharp. "Is that true?" She swallowed her composure, slipping. "David, please don't make a scene. It's Christmas." "Answer me," he said louder now. Her voice cracked. She didn't need it. She's barely holding a part-time job. She's not even finished with community college. She doesn't have a plan. Tyler is about to graduate, and he needed a place. He's responsible. My father's jaw tightened. "I bought that house for Lauren. I put her name on it. That was her gift, not his." "You were gone," Brenda snapped back, her voice breaking. Someone had to decide. So you decided for yourself, he said. The weight of the words filled the room, leaving no space for her reply. I stood then, my hands shaking but my voice clear. I've lived in this house like a guest since I was 9. I've watched Tyler get everything praise space opportunity. I didn't ask for much, but that house was finally something of mine. And you stole it. I turned to Tyler. And you moved in knowing it wasn't yours. You didn't even ask why your name was on the mailbox instead of mine. He muttered, I didn't know. You always knew, I said, flat and certain. My father leaned back, his eyes shining with something like regret. He looked at Brenda, then at me. For a moment the silence held all of us in place. I reached into my bag, pulled out the folder, and placed it on the table. I spoke to a lawyer, I said. The deed is in my name, the transfer is legal, the house is mine, and if Tyler doesn't leave by the end of the month, I'll file for eviction. Gasps rippled around the table. Tyler stood so quickly his chair scraped against the floor. Are you serious? He demanded. I'm done being erased, I said. You've had your place in this family. Now I'm taking mine. My father said nothing at first, but his eyes glistened as he looked at me. Brenda's napkin slipped from her lap, falling unnoticed to the floor. You're tearing this family apart, she whispered. No, I said quietly. You did that the moment you took what wasn't yours and called it love. The table sat frozen. Every face turned toward us, the holiday meal abandoned. And in that silence, I knew nothing would ever be the same again. I left the table before anyone else moved, slipping my coat over my shoulders and walking out into the cold night air. The porch was quiet, the only sound the faint chatter of neighbors celebrating down the block. I sat on the steps, my breath visible in the winter air, my hands trembling from everything that had just unfolded inside. For the first time in years, I had spoken without hesitation, and the weight of it left me still and exhausted. It wasn't long before the front door creaked open behind me. My father stepped out, his movements slower than usual, as though every word from the dining room had landed on his shoulders at once. He sat down beside me, silent at first, our eyes fixed on the street where snowflakes drifted down in uneven patterns. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then his voice broke the quiet. I didn't know he said the words thick in his throat. I thought I was giving you something that showed I hadn't forgotten. I had no idea, Brenda. I trusted her. His head dropped into his hands, and I could see the shame etched across his face. I kept my gaze on the snow, my breath forming clouds in the night air. She made it look like I didn't exist, I said softly, and for a while I started to believe her. He turned to me, his eyes wet in the dim light from the porch. I should have been here, he said. I missed your art shows, your birthdays, your life. I thought sending money, making plans for the future was enough, but I wasn't there to see what was happening. His voice shook, but he didn't look away. I let the silence settle again before answering. You were gone, but you were the only one who tried to give me something real, and that's what she took from me. He nodded, unable to speak for a moment, then reached into his coat pocket. From it, he pulled out a small wrapped box with a green ribbon. I was going to give this to you after dinner, he said, his voice quieter now. He placed it in my hands, and I untied the bow. Inside was a key attached to a tag marked simply, for Lauren. It's for a lockbox, he explained. I filled it with the letters I meant to send but never did. I wanted you to know I was thinking of you even when I didn't know how to say it. I closed my fingers around the key, feeling the weight of it press into my palm. It wasn't just metal. It was the first time in years that something felt like it belonged only to me. 2 weeks later, Tyler moved out quietly. No arguments, no attempts to defend himself, just a short message to my father that said, "The place is cleaned out." I never replied. There was nothing left to discuss between us. When I stepped into the hollow pine house for the first time as its rightful owner, sunlight streamed through the windows as though the house itself had been waiting. The rooms were empty, the walls bare, but each space carried a sense of possibility that had never been mine before. I walked barefoot across the floors, letting the echo of each step remind me that this was real. I didn't bring much at first, just a few boxes of clothes, my sketchbooks, and the red lockbox my father had given me. I set it on the mantel of the fireplace, its presence small but steady, a reminder of what had been lost and what had been reclaimed. I painted the walls myself, choosing colors that felt alive, white in the hallway to clear the shadows, soft green in the kitchen, to bring warmth, and deep blue in my bedroom, a shade that carried peace instead of silence. One afternoon, I hung the watercolor Brenda once dismissed right by the front door. Its rainy street corner greeted me every time I stepped inside, no longer hidden away in my room, but standing as a quiet declaration that my voice mattered. Friends visited and left small gifts plants for the windowsills, candles for the shelves. My professor from community college sent a handwritten card that read, "You are exactly where you're meant to be." Every Saturday, my father came by with his tool bag, helping me fix leaky faucets or paint shutters. He didn't try to explain anymore. He just showed up, and sometimes that was enough. The distance between us began to shrink with each passing week. Evenings often ended with me sitting on the porch, a cup of tea warming my hands as I looked out at the quiet street. For the first time, I wasn't imagining escape or silence. I was imagining a future built on something solid, something mine. But I knew the story wasn't finished. Brenda's silence wouldn't last forever, and family ties don't unravel cleanly. The confrontation had ended in my favor, but the cost of the truth was still rippling through every corner of our lives. The weeks that followed felt different from any season I had lived through before. For the first time, I unlocked my own front door, stepped into a space that carried my name, and felt the weight of belonging settle into me. The house at Hollow Pine had been stripped bare when Tyler left, but the emptiness was a relief. It gave me the freedom to fill it piece by piece, not with borrowed approval, but with choices that were finally mine. My father came by every weekend, his presence quieter than it used to be, but steadier. He carried tools instead of excuses, and together we repaired small things that had been left undone. One Saturday, he fixed a dripping faucet while I painted the trim along the windows. The work was simple, but the rhythm of it made the silence between us feel different. It wasn't the heavy quiet of absence anymore. It was the calm of two people finding their way back toward each other. When we took breaks, he would sit at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee and glance around as though memorizing the details of the room. "It looks like you've been here forever," he said, once his voice soft. I didn't answer right away, but I smiled, and for him that was enough. Word spread slowly through the family about what had happened at Christmas. Some relatives reached out with brief messages, surprised by what they had learned, while others stayed silent, unwilling to choose sides. Brenda never spoke to me directly again, but I heard from one of my cousins that she insisted I had turned everyone against her. Tyler kept his distance as well. He packed up his belongings and moved into an apartment across town, leaving behind the red door that had been his only briefly. Inside Hollow Pine, I built a different life. I set up one room as a small studio, the floor dotted with jars of brushes and the smell of fresh paint clinging to the air. The first canvas I leaned against the wall was that watercolor Brenda once dismissed, and every time I passed it, I felt a quiet strength return. I filled the shelves with books I loved, arranged plants by the windows, and made meals that filled the kitchen with warmth. Slowly, friends began to drop by, and laughter echoed through rooms that had never heard mine before. One evening, after hanging curtains in the living room, my father handed me a small envelope. Inside was a folded note in his handwriting. It wasn't long, just a few lines about how proud he was and how sorry he felt for what I had endured. He didn't read it aloud. He simply placed it in my hand and said, "Keep it, for when I can't find the right words." I tucked it inside the lockbox with the other letters he had saved for me. The key rested on the mantel, not just a reminder of what had been hidden, but a symbol of what we were slowly rebuilding. There were still quiet evenings when I thought about the years lost, the birthdays that passed unnoticed, and the silence that had shaped me. Yet, as I sat on my porch watching the streetlights flicker on, I knew the balance had shifted. I wasn't waiting for approval anymore. I wasn't measuring my worth against Tyler's achievements or Brenda's rules. The house itself stood as proof that what was stolen could be returned, and that justice sometimes arrived in the form of steady change rather than sudden victory. Still, I sensed there were conversations yet to come, questions about what forgiveness might mean and whether family ties could survive betrayal. My father and I had begun the process of healing, but Brenda's absence cast a shadow that wouldn't vanish easily. As much as I wanted to close the door on that chapter completely, I knew the story wasn't over. Life at Hollow Pines settled into a rhythm that felt both new and deeply overdue. Each morning I opened the curtains and let the light spill into rooms that once belonged to someone else, but now reflected me. The colors on the walls, the canvases leaning in corners, even the faint smell of paint and coffee blended into something that felt like home. My father kept his word, showing up every week without fail. Some days he brought tools to fix small things. Other days, he simply sat with me while I worked on a sketch, listening quietly, no longer distracted or far away. We didn't try to rewrite the years we lost. Instead, we built something steadier in the present, something that didn't need to be explained or excused. Brenda's presence faded quickly, though her absence lingered in its own way. Family gatherings grew smaller, quieter, with some relatives keeping their distance. Tyler rarely crossed my path again. He had his own life now, one that no longer overlapped with mine. The silence from them was sharp at first, but over time it softened into background noise. What mattered most was that the weight of their control no longer followed me through the door. I poured myself into my art, applying for a grant I never would have dared to before. My spare bedroom turned into a studio, its walls alive with color and texture. Friends visited often, and their laughter filled spaces that had once been empty. The house, once a stolen promise, became a place of growth and possibility. One evening, I unlocked the little red box my father had given me. Inside were letters he had written during his years abroad, short notes about places he visited, memories of my mother, and reminders that he was thinking of me. Reading them, I understood that while his absence had left scars, his intent had always been to keep me close in the only way he knew. Forgiveness didn't come instantly, but it found me slowly in the quiet hours when I realized we were both learning how to stay. Looking back, I see now that justice is not always loud. Sometimes it is steady and patient, like a door opening at last or a room filling with light after years in the dark. I learned that silence does not mean surrender, and that even when others try to erase you, there is strength in claiming your space again. If you've ever felt overlooked or pushed aside, I hope my story reminds you that your worth doesn't depend on who notices you. Sometimes the truest justice is simply stepping into the life that was always meant to be yours. Thank you for listening to my story. Before you go, I'd love to know, have you ever had to stand up for something that was rightfully yours? Share your story in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you'd like to hear more.